are going to continue a discussion that is very controversial because it challenges a lot of preconceived ideas regarding what we have been trained to believe the text states. As you guys know, my approach is not to focus on one scripture or two scriptures, but take the whole corpus of thought throughout the Tanakh into account. I have found that so many times we will focus on those one or two scriptures that make us feel good, that go along with what we want to believe, that maybe we've been taught this, or maybe we even believe that this is what justice is, or that we believe this is how God should be. So we kind of interpret him according to our own beliefs, according to our own value system. And when I had my crisis of faith, what I attempted to do was to throw everything I knew out and to begin again, to start over again. I couldn't dictate what the text stated. I couldn't dictate my own feelings towards it, although it's really hard to do that completely, but I at least tried. And I feel like what I came away from there with was something that is this pure refined gold. It's something that I find is very enlightening, and it helps us to make sense of the world that we live in. So many times I see people leave a faith in God because of the idea of human suffering. That is probably the number one issue that, regardless of your creed, whether you're Christian, whether you're Jewish, that is an issue that we all face and that we all struggle with. But I believe that this study regarding the character of God really helps to enlighten that. It helps to give us a better idea of God's mercy and his character. So with that, I am going to go small. My son played with my video, so it might be a little bit different. So we'll see how this works, but hopefully we'll be able to see. So we're going to go through this, and this is going to be in kind of painstaking detail, because I want you guys to be able to get this and to see it for yourselves. So we are looking specifically to, this week at God's covenant of mercy. And this is a prequel to chapter 17. Chapter 17, we begin to get into the concept of blood guilt. And we need to understand where that concept comes from, how it originates, and how it has played out through ancient Israel's history. And going through this in kind of a painstaking detail will allow us to do this. So one thing that you find is reiterated several times in the Tanakh is this idea of keeping covenant and mercy. But it's almost as though God is reiterating this idea of covenant of mercy as we go through this. So I wanted to go back and recapture what we had studied last week and break it down and compare it so that you see the consistency throughout Scripture, or at least throughout the Torah. So God gave, as we looked at last week, the terms of his grace. So this defines how YHWH would show grace to Israel, and specifically to families within Israel and their descendants. And I want to show you how consistent it is. The very first covenant, the Sinai covenant, defined that YHWH would show mercy. And let me see, I am seeing that this is not coming in just right. Let me go back over to my screen and play with this for just a minute and see if I can get it to show up on the screen better. All right, let's see if that adjustment helps at all. Give me just a minute here. Okay, I think that comes through a little bit better. Okay. So what we see is with every single covenant that YHWH makes with Israel is that the terms of those covenants are the same. So at the Sinai covenant, we see that Jehovah said he would show mercy to thousands of them that love him and keep his commandments. And we see that is reiterated again in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. Now, this time we find that when God recovenants with Israel in Exodus 34, that the qualifications of, okay, it looks good on your side. All right. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. I guess what I am seeing seems that it's been truncated a little bit. So if there's any, guys, if there's any ever issue with the video or the audio, please just type it in the comments because I am trying to keep track of those. So what we see is that in the Exodus 34, when God recovenants with Israel, he expands the concept of his mercy and his grace. He further defines this. And if you'll remember, Israel's history, what had happened just before that in Exodus 33 really plays into this, because here in Exodus 20, Israel had made this covenant with this audible voice that they had heard on Mount Sinai. They had committed, both they and their children, they had committed to following this covenant. And then the 40 days later, when we come to Exodus 33, Israel breaches the very first commandment, which is to have no other gods before Yahweh, and they breach it by making a golden calf. So God expands this concept and this idea of his mercy because he wants Israel to understand his mercy. He wants them to get it. So he goes into more aspects of his character. He again upholds the idea that he will keep mercy for thousands of that love him and keep his commandments, and he will forgive iniquity and transgression of sin. So we see a consistency, but also a further clarification. And if you'll remember, this goes right along with the patriarchal covenants. When we looked at chapter 3, every single patriarchal covenant would expand. It would add another stipulation or another qualification, but never once did it do away with or did it absolve any other stipulation, promise, or aspect of a previous covenant. Rather, what you see is this constant unfolding where one covenant is absorbed into the following covenant, and the covenant keeps expanding and expanding. So again, in Moses's prayer, let me come back to Exodus 34. The one thing that we find, it may have been added, or it may have been part of the original covenant that Yahweh did not exactly clarify. We're not sure of that. But he clarifies in Exodus 34, after Israel breaches the covenant with him, that he would by no means clear the guilty. And Moses's prayer when Israel rebels again in Numbers 14, that is reiterated again. And Moses acknowledges that Yahweh will not clear the guilty. So then we come to the aspect of the grace aspect and the mercy aspect of his covenant. And notice that in both the Sinai and the Moab Deuteronomy covenant, they have the exact same wording. They state the exact same thing. So one covenant, again, upholds a former covenant. Never once in all of Israel's history do you ever have a covenant that replaces, as far as the stipulations, or does away with any part of an older covenant. Rather, they constantly absorb. Now, how certain things are applied may change. For instance, how things are done in the wilderness can change how they are done in the land. For instance, when they're in the wilderness, the command is given for Israel to bury their excrement. Go outside the camp and dig a hole and bury your excrement. Well, when Israel gets into cities, they're living in close quarters, that's not really feasible. But that command can still be upheld and still be followed by implementing sewage systems and drainage systems whereby waste is taken away and out of the city. You know, today our modern cities actually follow Torah by its septic systems and its public water treatment plants within cities. So we inadvertently follow Torah. Whether you want to or not, we kind of have to do that so that we don't have these national epidemics. like they did with the bubonic plague. And so the other thing that we find is the limits of Yahovah's mercy continue to be the same. Now, at the Sinai covenant, Yahovah had stipulated two things: that one, that he was a jealous God, and secondly, that this judgment of the iniquity when he visits. And notice where this idea of visiting the iniquity upon the fathers of the children to the third and fourth generation. And he clarifies this, that it is specifically to those that hate him. So if you do not hate Yahovah, if you love him, even though you are of the third and fourth generation that has hated Yahovah, there's still hope for you. If you repent, you return to Yahovah, you keep his commandments, then this judgment will not fall upon you or your children if you are faithful to the covenant. So that is a distinction there to note. Now, let me just make sure I am not seeing. I'm going to refresh my screen really quick on the YouTube side because I'm not seeing that it's keeping up. So give me just a minute. Okay, I see that it's keeping up now. I have a lag, and I don't know if it's Facebook or just my particular system, but there is a lag on my side. So again, if anything, if it doesn't come through, just let me know. So what we see again is Moses again reiterates this idea that Yahovah will not clear the guilty. That enters in with the second recovenanting at Sinai. And then you see again with the Moab Shechem covenant and with the Sinai covenant, this character of Yahovah remains consistent. Yahovah is a jealous God, and he will visit the iniquity of the children, of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations, again, of those that hate him. So what we are going to be looking at again is this idea of visiting iniquity. What does it mean? So many times in life, we find that a person is very, very wicked. Let's take Hitler, for example, or Mussolini. I mean, in our generation, there are probably 24 people you can think right off the top of your head that fit this description. Mao Zedong. I mean, there's all these wicked, wicked people. Well, you find that children play when iniquity is not expiated, when it is not expunged by society. And this is actually where you and I play a very, very important part. You and I and our government are really, really key in this, because it is up to our government to expiate crimes that are committed. And when that expiation does not occur, that iniquity remains. There's old jokes and adages about Yahovah keeping a balance sheet, and it's like, Mike Warnke used to say, oh, that's 3 more for Johnny, 2 more for Mary, and it's not that idea. And it's not something to be flippant about. And it's not like, not everything constituted sin. Yahovah is very, very specific as to the crimes that constitute egregious sins. And it's only these egregious sins, this violation of the covenant, the 10 commandments, that really become very important for Israel, and this inheriting by the children. So it's not, if Israel forgets to clean themselves, or, after intercourse, or if they violate other say they accidentally eat pork. That is not what is important. The important thing is that they do those things, they make them right. But we are going to see that there are specific things within the covenant, very specific things, that could not be expiated except by a particular person or their particular house. So now going on, this idea of visiting iniquity upon them. That is reiterated in both covenants. So what we find is that when 3 to 4 consecutive generations of a wicked man's descendants hate Yahovah, they refuse to obey his law, Yahovah will visit the iniquity of that family's sins and judge the 4th or generation if it continues to hate Yahovah and defies his law. Now this again, if you're in the 3rd or 4th generation and you turn from your forefathers' iniquities, you turn to Yahweh, you seek him with all your heart and soul, and you walk not in the way of your forefathers, just like Ezekiel 18 and Ezekiel 33, then you shall live, and that judgment that will fall upon your household will not fall upon you. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be some hardship. And what we are going to look into next week is the concept of national judgment, and how this, the household of fathers, fits within the more aggregate concept of the iniquity of a land or the iniquity of a nation. We're not going to get into that today. That will be for the following weeks. But we're going to build very, very slowly, because these are such foundational principles that I really hope you guys can get them, and that it becomes very easy to use, something you can commit to heart. Moses clarifies Jehovah's mercy in Deuteronomy, and he really kind of takes all these concepts that you've seen in the first Sinai covenant and the second Sinai covenant, that he does again after Israel sins, after the spies go into the land and Israel sins. Jehovah puts it all together in Deuteronomy, and this is what he says. He says, "Know therefore that Jehovah your God, he is God. He is faithful. He keeps covenant and mercy with them that love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations." So here, this again is this grace aspect. The Jehovah's grace is defined. But then here we have the limits of Jehovah's mercy, where it says, "And he repays them that hate him to their face, to destroy them. He will not be slack to him that hates him. He will repay him to his face." Now, what we're going to see is that the Jehovah's repaying in a righteous, just, moral society, that Jehovah has actually put people in place to administer his justice. He's taught us the way to walk therein. He's taught us how to judge. And he has taught us to be administrators and judges to carry out his law within a nation. So when that occurs, and again, this kind of gets into next week's lesson, but when that occurs, then it is repaid to the face. I mean, the very face of him who commits the crime. But when society begins to pity, and this is one thing that you find over and over again in Deuteronomy, is this command not to pity the evildoer, not to pity the wicked. But you find that when a society becomes more prosperous, when they focus so much on love and so much on mercy that they forget the justice side, and they pity the evildoer, you find that then evil then takes over the justice that once prevailed, and justice becomes slack. And then all of a sudden you have the innocent that are actually paying for the sins of the righteous, for the sins of the wicked, and the whole paradigm is turned upside down. So this idea of not pitying the evildoer, not slacking in justice, is really key to justice being administered in that first generation that hates Yahweh and despises his commandments. So what we're looking at today is when society fails to administer this justice, when it becomes kind of a debt for the family that is before the face of Yahweh. It may not be something that you and I see, but Yahweh knows. So just to a summary of both covenants, both the Moab Shechem covenant as well as the Sinai covenant, we find that Yahweh is faithful. He keeps covenant and mercy to 1,000 generations that love him. So this is an incredible promise, because today we are not even 1,000 generations from Sinai. Every century has about 4 generations, 3 to 4 generations. So there is still a lot of time left on this 1,000 generation limit. And I don't even see this as a limit. This is really more of a minimum. This is Yahweh saying, this is the bare minimum of my grace and my mercy to them who love me and keep my commandments. So how do we show our love to Yahweh? We show that by keeping his commandments, by walking in his ways, by seeking him. And this is very important. I've we find that in Exodus 31, that the sign that we are in compliance of the Sinai covenant is the fact that we sanctify the Shabbat. That sanctifying of the Sabbath gives Yahovah something tangible that he can look down from heaven and he can see that we are in compliance. Now, remember with the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Yahovah talks, or when his angel talks with Abraham in Genesis 18, he says, behold, the sin or the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah has come up to me, and I am come down to see whether or not it is true. Does it hold up? And you find that these angels, these messengers, are sent to the city to investigate, and they look for tangible evidence, and they indeed find it. So, and in that case, they found that the sins very much outweighed any righteousness that may have been in the city. Same thing with keeping the commandments. When we keep the 10 commandments, it gives God a very tangible outward manifestation that we are in compliance. The law of Moses, which is an expansion of the 10 commandments, it shows us how to apply those in everyday life. It does not mean that the law of Moses is invalid, but rather it takes the 10 commandments and it extrapolates those and gives us a real world constitution that we can actually put into day-to-day life. So the next trait is Yahovah does not hold any, even those that love him, guiltless when they sin. And we're going to see that in action today as we continue to go through this. So Yahovah will repay those that hate him, and he will destroy those that hate him. Now, again, that destruction does not always come in the first generation. And as we will see next week, it often comes in the third and fourth generation of those that hate him. Now, Yahovah's covenant of mercy has a condition. And that condition of mercy, of covenant and mercy, is found in Deuteronomy 7:12. If you hearken to these judgments and keep them to do them, the Yahovah your God will keep to you the covenant of mercy which he swore to your fathers. So again, this covenant of mercy it's always this if-then scenario. It's never a blank ticket. It's never a carte blanche, open-ended contract whereby Israel can say, oh, we have the temple. Oh, we have our forefathers. Oh, Yahovah covenanted with us. Oh, we're God's chosen people. No, that dog does not hunt. The only way, even if you are the seed of Abraham, say you are the line, and somehow your line preserves this firstborn heritage of Abraham all the way down to our present day. It does not matter if you do not keep the law and the covenant. You have to obey the judgments, you have to keep them, and you have to listen and do them in order to have access to this mercy. So just to kind of reiterate here a summary, and you do find that there is an evolution of Israel's national covenant. The rebellion that Israel did at Mount Sinai, it is very much reflected in the second covenanting. And you see that throughout so many of the statutes that God gives to Israel. When Israel rebels at the waters of Meribah in Exodus 15, you find that, Exodus 15:26 says, if you are faithful and just to listen to all these commandments and statutes and judgments that I give you this day, I will put none of these diseases upon you that I placed upon the Egyptians. But it states in another chapter, and I forget the verse, that it was that incident that Yahovah told Moses to take and to make into a statute and a judgment for Israel. So that history, that event is actually incorporated into the law of Moses to account for that history. So there's a lot of remembering. There's a lot of things, a lot of statutes and judgments that are there because of Israel's actions. And they're really there for us to learn from them and to enlighten our ways so we don't repeat those mistakes. So, just a summary. The first Sinai covenant, you find it did indeed define and establish the limits of God's mercies and the expanse of God's grace. I should have added that to my bullet point. I did not. The second Sinai covenant, this was after Israel's breach of pact, and it impacted the covenant with the added stipulation that God would not hold the guilty sinless, and that he would hold the guilty accountable, and he would not overlook their sin, even within those parameters of Moses, of mercy. Moses' prayer reflects both the Sinai covenants, both the first and the second Sinai covenant. And then you find that all of these events, all of this history is totally absorbed in Deuteronomy and in the Deuteronomy covenant or the Moab Shechem covenant. Now, just a quick little note on, most scholars refer to the Deuteronomy covenant as the Deuteronomic covenant. I use Moab because each covenant was site-centric, meaning that each of them took place at a different location. Both of the Sinai covenants took place, as the name implies, at Mount Sinai. The Moab Shechem, and in the book I do determine it Moab Shechem covenant, because even though Yahweh covenanted with Israel on the plains of Moab, that covenant was not ratified until I think it was about 2 months later, when Israel trailblazed away to Shechem, and then they ratified the covenant. They activated it on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, but with the blessings of curses, that whole ceremony that you see in Joshua 5-8. So you find that it's a Moab Shechem covenant because even though it's given to Israel outside the promised land, it's not validated until they come into the land. So I think that's very neat. So anyways, I find that it's site specific, and that's the reason for the name. So now going on and coming back to this idea of this family cycle of the third and fourth generation. This really comes down to inheritance. Now, this is a very unpolitically correct topic. This is something that we are very uncomfortable with. This is something that we fight against and we try to deny. But as much as we try, it doesn't, we can't get rid of reality. We can't get rid of the fact that this is how life works. So in our modern time, we see so many times that a child or a grandchild's future is often determined by the decisions that we make, or maybe our decisions are determined by the choices that our forefathers have made. This comes down to financial status. Children that are born into poverty tend to continue that cycle of poverty. And, there is a way of thinking in poverty that only continues the cycle because you don't always see the opportunities that are before you, or how hard work or taking advantage of different opportunities can totally change your future. So you can call this karma if you want, but this is kind of a reality of how the world works. Parenting skills. So many times you find that children of abusive parents continue that abusive behavior with their children and their grandchildren. The same holds true for drug and alcohol addiction. If you are born if you have an alcoholic parent, a lot of times you have to work very, very hard not to repeat that behavior, especially when you come into stressful situations. Your father or your mother, when they were under stress, they would, just take a sip to just, it just lighten the moment. Let's not be worried about it. Let's de-stress. Let's just take a little sip. And for some people, that's fine. But for other people who, face and have those struggles in their family, that cycle, it's not just a sip. It becomes several cartons or several kegs later, and it becomes a continual habit that's hard to break. Education, same thing. Oftentimes the education of the family determines how well educated the child will be. And education plays such an important part regarding the ability to sort through facts, to think logically, to adduce different situations, and to make rational judgments. Okay, Billy writes, are the two covenants the result of Yahweh writing them two times with changes in the second one? Billy, I believe so. Each covenant reflected the changes as they were made. Now, of course, the Moab covenant was not written by Yahweh. The Moab covenant was written by Moses. Now, judgment within families. And this is where we get into the more controversial issues. And this is something that we really work hard to deny in Scripture, because it brings the accountability of Scripture to life. So Job and King David provide a description as to how the expiration of the limits of Yahweh's mercy plays out in family's history. And we're going to see this. But first, I want to come back before we look at it in the actual life of David, which is what we're going to do today. I want to bring us back to the concepts that Israel had during biblical times. There is very much over the last 100 years this trend towards anachronism. And that means that we interpret Scripture through the lens of what is socially acceptable today, what is socially likable within religion. Well, to know Yahweh, we really have to go back 2,000 years and see him as did the people who wrote the Scripture that we have today. So we're going to look at Job, and we are going to look at King David. So Job reiterates this idea of the fruits of wickedness and how the iniquities of the forefathers play out in their children's history. So this is Job 27. And let me just make this statement regarding Job. When you read the book of Job, just because it's in the Bible does not mean that it's truth. When you read the book of Job, you have to be very, very conscious as to who is speaking. Job's three friends are Edomites, and oftentimes what they speak is Edomite theology. When you read Job's words, his words are more in line with Yahweh, and they very much hold a very Torah ideology with his words. Let's see, Libby says generational patterns aren't permanent, but we have to seek Yahweh's help to correcting the path. And that's exactly right. And that's going to be key. And we are actually going to come back to that in about 2 or 3 lessons from now as we kind of come full circle with this. So this is what Job says in Job 27. This is the portion of a wicked man with Yahweh, the heritage of oppressors. Now notice this focus on oppressing. One man oppressing his fellow man was one of the most egregious sins you could commit in Yahweh's sight. So the heritage of oppressor which they shall receive from the Almighty. If his children be multiplied, it is for the sword, and his offspring shall not be satisfied with bread. Those that remain of him shall not be buried in death, and his widows shall not weep. Well, there's oftentimes where a wicked man is not necessarily mourned by his wife or his children. I would hope that no one mourned Hitler's death, or no one mourned Mao's death, or Stalin's death. There's a lot of wicked people whose deaths we should not mourn. And I understand that today there is this push that you should just love everyone and just kind of turn a blind eye towards evil. But in doing that, we really weaken our values. We weaken our sense of moral justice and judgment. And we have to place this distinction between righteousness and wickedness, because that is part of our salvation and the heritage that Yahweh has given to us. The other thing that we find, notice this point that if his children be multiplied, it is for the sword. It is interesting. I believe it's 8 different times. I'm going off of memory. Deuteronomy 28 in the curses of the law talks about how Yahweh would cut Israel short, and how Israel's children would be given to the sword. So the covenant within Deuteronomy 28 very much encapsulates and absorbs these ideas for the entire nation of Israel when the nation has reached a point of national degradation. Again, we find there's this idea of not being satisfied with bread, and this idea of hunger, of famine. Now, so many times hunger, not being satisfied with bread, is not always because of famine in the land. Sometimes that's just plain economics. You look at what Mao did in China. They had an abundance of land, of produce, but rather it was government policies that went into place that caused the people to become hungry. And you had the national famine of, I think it was right around 1962. So with this, and you'll notice too, I understand that a lot of people will apply this to Israel and solely to Israel. I have found in my study of both ancient Israel, of the law, of the Tanakh, as well as world history, that Yahweh's covenant, that his law that he gives us, it is a natural law, and it is universal to all humanity. And you see this play out over and over again in many generations. And you don't find Yahweh being partial. Now, coming to Psalms 109. Psalms 109 is written about a wicked man. Now, this is this is specifically in the context of when Absalom had rebelled against David, and within the concept of him wanting Ahithophel and counselors to pervert Absalom's judgment so that he would fall and that his plan and his coup would not succeed. But this is what David prays for his enemies and prays for the people who had revolted against him. He says, "Let a wicked man be set over him. Let his children be fatherless, his wife a widow. Let his children be continually vagabonds and beg. Let them seek their bread also out of the desolate places. Let the extortioner catch all that he has. Let the stranger spoil his labor. Let there be none to extend mercy to him, neither let there be any to show favor to his fatherless children. Let his posterity be cut off. In the generation following, let their name be blotted out. Let the iniquity of his fathers be remembered with Yahweh." And that's a very powerful statement right there. "And let not the sin of his mother be blotted out. Let them be before Yahweh continually, that he may cut off the memory of them from the earth." Again, this idea that your memory is expunged, that, you lived, you existed, you have a history on the earth, but when you die, there's no history of you, there's no trace of you or your family or that you were even here. Verse 16, "Because he remembered not to show mercy, but persecuted the poor and needy man, that he may even slay those that are a broken heart." So this is a very, very strong call for justice against a man, against his children, and against his descendants. Now, again, this cry that David has, this prayer that he has, and this is really a curse, could not fall on a man's righteous children if they had turned to the covenant, if they had taken it upon themselves to obey. But those children that continued in their forefathers' ways, those children that continued to oppress, that continued to walk in iniquity, this curse, this judgment, or this prayer could very much fall upon them. So families of a wicked forefather often face economic hardship, difficulty of personal relationships, violence, hunger, and when they die, all too often no one buries them. You find this really in Isaiah and Jeremiah, where it says that they will die and there will be none to bury them. And archaeologically, you can find this in many cities, where archaeologists will go in, they'll get through the ground level excavations, and here on the floor of the city are bones, incomplete skeletons or partial skeletons just litter the city, in doorways and in houses, indicating that that city came to a very violent end, and sand just kind of buried it up and kind of really preserved that history for us today. Now, looking at the judgment specifically against David's house, David really provides an incredible case study as to how Yahweh takes the expanse and the limit of his mercy and applies it to the lives of a particular family. Now, David had incredible responsibility because he was Israel's shepherd. As he set the tone, so was the tone of the nation. So many times the leader of a nation sets the tone for the people who live under him. And you find this is the case with David. And we're just going to go ahead and read 2 Samuel 12. And this is Nathan's words to David after he had sinned with Bathsheba. Now, David had sinned in two ways, and I have highlighted these in yellow. Yet David had broken the covenant. He had broken the 10 commandments in two ways. First, he had committed adultery. That was his first sin. The second sin is that he had committed murder by having Uriah killed. So these are Nathan's words to David. Why have you despised the commandment of Yahweh to do evil in his sight? You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife, and you have slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says Yahweh, behold, I raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun, for you did it secretly. But I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. So this is the idea that of karma, of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And it is one thing that you find so often. Let me grab a drink of water here. Is that sin often touches people that had no part in the sin itself. In this case, you find that David's concubines actually bear the brunt of this judgment against David. When Absalom rebelled and David had to flee for his wife, Absalom basically raped 10 concubines on the roof of the palace. In ancient times, this was seen as a power play. By taking the king's concubines, you were displacing the king. You were becoming king by taking his wives. You find that Adonijah at one point in time tries to do this as well. And Solomon has him put to death later on because he attempted the same thing. But in this case, so many times, the sin has unintended consequences. You can have one city in a place clear across the world where people do not follow kashrut, the biblically clean laws, and it affects a disease that ends up touching the whole entire earth. So there are so many times casualties that go beyond a particular person. Just the unintended consequences along the way. But what I want to focus specifically on today is Yahweh's direct judgment, because there's indirect consequences that occur, and then there are direct judgments from Yahweh that do occur. In this case, the direct consequence from YHWH was that the sword would never depart from David's house. And this is just a short history. This was the violence and the death that occurred because of David's choice to break the covenant in two places, in both adultery and murder. First, you find that his first son with Bathsheba died. You find that Ammon raped Tamar. Absalom avenged his sister Tamar. He instigated a coup, and he killed Israelites in battle. Later on, Adonijah, another son, rebelled in a coup. Eventually, Adonijah was put to death by Solomon. You find that Jehoram killed all of his brothers later on. Then later on, Athaliah killed all the king's son, and only Joash was saved. Other kings also displayed violence towards David's sons. And then finally, you have the kings of both Egypt and Babylon who killed David's sons as well. Throughout the diaspora, when Israel returned to the land in the Second Temple period, we're going to get into this in maybe 3-4 lessons from now, but you find that those descendants of Zerubbabel that lived in Jerusalem and in the land of Judea, all of those children became a prey to the Romans later on. And there were horrific holocausts that occurred in the land of Israel. And truly, this sword never has departed from David's house. And this is one reason why YHWH gave David what is called a covenant of light. And this was a promise that David's house would always have seed alive at some point in time in Israel's history. So no matter what violence his house saw, even though there would always be a sword within his house, it would be attributed to the wicked and not the righteous in his household. Marlene points out that once again, forgiveness did not mean there would be no consequence. Exactly. YHWH's forgiveness of David did not mean that it alleviated the consequence for his household. And so much of this was just seeing the choices that your father has made. I have seen many children, and this seems to affect sons especially hard, whose fathers have had affairs. And those sons really, really struggle in their relationships with their wives. I have seen that over and over again because the fathers don't often realize that the path they set, the way in which they walk, their sons kind of have this built-in innate desire, or if you want to call it I'm trying to think of the right word, when children, when birds fly, kind of a migratory device, or this habit where they walk in the ways of their forefathers. And you see this time and time again. Now, just real quick, I want to touch on the death of David's son with Bathsheba, because this is a case where, and I know a lot of people struggle with this, David's son did no sin. He was innocent. He was an innocent casualty of this. Yes, proclivity. That's a good word. There's another one I was thinking of. It'll probably come to me later on. But in David's sin with Bathsheba, it was an innocent boy that died. But there was really no other judgment that YHWH could place upon David. If he had removed David from office, all Israel would have suffered, because any son that came to office would not have been as righteous as David. When Rehoboam came to office after Solomon, we found that he horribly oppressed the people. Had he removed David from office, then whoever was there would not have been given the mercy. You would have had economic stability, and it also would have made Israel a prey to her enemies that were round about her. within that also was the fact that Yahweh had given David a dynastic covenant that he could not go back on. He had promised that the monarchy would be in David's house. So any judgment that occurred had to be within David and his household. And if he couldn't remove David from office, well, then he could plague David with disease. But again, that would affect David's ability to righteously govern over Israel. So these are very deep, and there some of the, what you see is not always easy to work through, because you do find instances where a righteous person or a person who hasn't lived very long does indeed die because of the fact that his father had sinned and broken the covenant. Now, we're going to go on to this idea of what that you find in the covenant of remembering sins and visiting the iniquity. So both Exodus and Moab, this is Exodus 20, both covenants read the exact same as we saw before. It says, I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. So what we're going to see is how the prophets, as Israel sins, and this is the course of Israel's history, you don't find prophets using this language until very late in Israel's history. This is going to be right around 720 BCE, and then again as you come in to around 600 BCE, both as the northern kingdom is taken from the land and as the southern kingdom is taken from the land. So you find that both Hosea and Jeremiah bring to Israel's knowledge the fact that Yahweh is going to now remember Israel's iniquities, and he is now going to visit her sins. So this is what Hosea says. They sacrifice flesh for the sacrifices of my offerings and eat it, but Yahweh will not accept them. Now will he remember the iniquity and visit their sins. They shall return to Egypt. Now, this remembering iniquity and visiting their sins upon them, as we saw a couple weeks ago, this coincides with the first phase of judgment from this universally applicable Noahic covenant, where Yahweh sends foreign beasts or wild beasts who will rob you of your children. And we went through that. So that, I believe, was 3 weeks ago, if you want to go back and refer to that. But it was also at the beginning of chapter 17 and the end of chapter 16 that we looked at that concept as well. Now, this idea that they will return to Egypt, this particular time when Yahweh visits Israel's sins, it is not an all-out slaughter or an all-out Holocaust. Rather, this particular judgment returns Israel to the oppression within the foreign land. It takes Israel out of the land, and it makes her serve deities of wood and stone, which can neither see nor hear, and she pines away in her forefathers' iniquity in a foreign land. So that is this particular judgment. Jeremiah also reiterates this for Judah. He says, thus says Yahweh to his people, thus they have loved to wander, they have not refrained their feet. Therefore Yahweh does not accept them. He will now remember their iniquity and visit their sins. So you find the exact same judgment that Hosea pronounces upon the northern kingdom for their sins is now being also pronounced upon the southern kingdom for their sins. So you see, God is not partial whatsoever in the law. He universally applies it. Now, this is the concept of a national judgment. This is when the sins of the third and fourth generation within all of Israel's families have reached such degradation. They are so pervasive throughout society that Yahweh can ignore them no more, and it calls out for his justice. Miriam asks, does a promise override sin? Yes, it does. It doesn't override the sin, but it can override how the judgment is applied. So the promise remains sure, but the application of the judgment can be altered in particular ways to account for that promise. Now we also here, this enters in the idea of Israel as a wild grape. Remember the phrase that Israel always used of, behold, our forefathers have eaten sour grapes and their children's teeth are set on edge. We're not going to get into that deeply today. We're going to save that for the next two lessons. But this is where that idiom comes from. And this is kind of the parable or the ideology that Israel had that coincided with that statement. And this is what Hosea says. He says, I found Israel like wild grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree and for her first time. But they went to Baal Peor and separated themselves to that shame, and their abominations were according as they loved. They have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. Therefore he will remember their iniquity, he will visit their sins. As for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away. Though they bring up children, yet will I bereave them. There shall be not a man left. Woe to them when I depart from them. So again, you have this idea of generational sins, of generational curses, of Yahovah visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the sin on the third and fourth generation. Now this corruption in the days of Gibeah, this is the story of the Levite that went to stay in Gibeah, and the men of the city wanted to come out and commit violent acts, and he gave his concubine. It's a very, 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 horrible story. But Hosea is saying that Israel's sins had become equal to the sins of Gibeah. So this tells us just how bad things were in the northern kingdom, that their sins should be compared to this. So now he is saying that if they have children, their children will be given to the sword. So again, we see that Yahovah does not clear the guilty. And this is just kind of a summary. Yahovah will willingly and fully forgive people who Yahovah willingly and fully forgave people who treacherously rebelled against him, such as the many times that Israel rebelled in the wilderness. Remember, there were 10 times. Although Yahovah forgave perversity, rebellion, and the trespass of his law for those who repented, he still allowed the people to reap the consequence of their choices, often allowing children to learn from their parents' mistakes. And you find so much throughout the Torah is that there's this idea that consequences can correct and they can teach. When King David rebelled through idolatry and murder, Yahovah stated that his offspring would live in strife and that his actions had created. David left the consequences of his actions and the strife of his disobedience had caused as a legacy for his offspring who had to unlearn their forefathers' righteous example. If Yahovah's people offered true sacrifices of the heart and mind and spirit, then they could be freed from the sins that cowered at the doorstep of their heart. So look at Genesis 4:7 for that one. So, and that is where we are going to stop with today. I was actually going to go a little bit further, but I'm going to stop at that point. Our next teaching is going to get into the concept of blood guilt. And let me see if I can come back into the screen real quick. Sorry. Hope I'm not making guys nauseated here. I'm trying to grab something else and it's not. Okay, there it goes. All right. So I'm back. All right. Was Daniel correct when he advised Nebuchadnezzar to show mercy after the dream of the tree and its stump? Yeah, he was, because with Nebuchadnezzar, remember, it was the idea that Nebuchadnezzar was oppressing people, that he had become high and lifted up. He was probably placing absorbent taxes on the people. requiring them to do labor in building cities and monumental works for him. So, yes, there is mercy. Now, the issue with mercy and justice, Yahweh's mercy that he applies for families goes today. Uh, if you have someone that commits a crime, and it's not a crime of murder, if they come from a righteous family, yes, there should be mercy should be shown to that person. If they come from a family that they're the third and fourth generation, and the family has a history of committing crimes and offenses. If it's not an egregious crime, well, then maybe some mercy should be shown. But we really have to work with that family as well and say, as a society, how can we help? Is there something that we can do that can help that family overcome the sins in which they are struggling? And that's kind of what we're going to be getting into in the future. But you do find that today we have really taken the inverse of this, where we extend mercy to those that have a rap sheet, maybe 1,000 crimes long. And the more crimes they commit, the more mercy that we show them. But let an upstanding citizen who has done everything right their entire life commit a crime, and it may not be an egregious crime, it could be just a misdemeanor, and we tend to throw the book at them. And, we will put an extremely long prison sentence on them, at least in America's system of justice today. So these are things that I think we should challenge, at least within our own ideology of what constitutes justice and judgment, as we come back into a framework of the idea of biblical justice and biblical mercy. Now, next week, we will be getting into the concept of blood guilt. And let me just say, we may not meet next week. Let me look at the date. Hold on, let me see. Yeah, next week we will not meet. It is my daughter's birthday, but we may meet either on Friday or Sunday. I'll just kind of play that by ear, and we'll take it from there. So thank you guys for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful day. Get out, enjoy the weather, and Shabbat Shalom.